Well, hello, my name is Cécile Shea. I am a special advisor and non-resident senior fellow here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. This is another of our virtual programs. We're holding a series of these until it's safe again to gather in a group in our location here in Chicago. We'd like to welcome all of you to this discussion of a very important topic with Krithika Varagur, who is the author of a new very interesting book on the manner in which Saudi Arabia has spread Wahhabi Islam and Wahhabi Islam's influence around the world in recent decades. At this time, when we are also preoccupied with disease and our own health and with the health of our economy, both personally and nationally, it's good to be reminded once in a while that there's still a lot of things going on in the world that we need to pay attention to. Both trends that had begun long before this disease, but also the possibility that other countries or other actors will take advantage of our distraction at this time and engage in behavior which will affect us for many years to come. And so that's why the Council is committed now and for the foreseeable future to continue with our virtual programs in this way so that we can both discuss some of these other matters unrelated to the virus, which are so important, but also continue looking at the way that the virus is affecting all of us and our economy. So today is another of those programs. We thank our members and we thank all of you for your continued support. And if you have the means right now to continue to support the Council in this work, we're deeply, deeply appreciative of that, however large or small that assistance may be. I remind you that the Council is a nonpartisan independent organization. The views expressed today are those of the speaker and not necessarily those of the Council itself. In about 30 minutes or so, we're going to switch to taking your questions, but at any time between now and then, and even during the question period, please log on to ccga.live to engage in some polls, to take some little quizzes on the topic at hand today, and to provide us your questions or to upvote questions that are already there and that you are particularly interested in. And I will try to get through as many of those questions as possible during the question and answer session. The order of the day is, in a moment, I'll turn the screen over to Krithika, who has a slideshow and an overview of her topic, of her book, and then we'll move to a discussion. I want to say that her new book is available at your local bookseller, as well as all of the normal places that you might buy books. It's also available electronically in whichever format you prefer. The Council has a long partnership with the bookseller, CELLAR. They have a wonderful online site where you can order books. It's the same group that you would be buying this book from if you were in person at our location down in Prudential Tower. Krithika Varagur is the Indonesia correspondent for the Guardian newspaper. Previous to that, she was the Indonesia correspondent for the Financial Times. She has been published in a lot of periodicals, including The Atlantic and the New York Times. She has won an award for crisis reporting from the Pulitzer Foundation. Her new book, The Call Inside the Global Saudi Religious Project, is the latest offering from on the Columbia Global Reports, a really wonderful series of accessible books that take a few hours to read and really bring you up to speed on some really important topics that are going on around the world. So we're very happy to have Krithika here today, and I'm going to turn things over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to see everyone who's tuned in for this virtual book tour, which has been underway since last week. I'm really excited to tell you a little bit about my book. I'm just going to give you an overview of what Saudi money is, how I came to this project, and some of the main takeaways that I discovered in 3 countries that I reported this book from. So without further ado, I'm going to share a little presentation with some photos from my fieldwork and then talk over that to you. So hope you can follow along. This is a bit experimental mode for me as well. Are we online?
Looks great.
Okay, great. So this book started for me with one question, which is, what is Saudi money? What does Saudi money do? What do we talk about when we talk about Saudi money? Like many of you, I grew up entirely in the shadow of the so-called War on Terror. I was 7 years old when 9/11 happened, and ever since then, in my entire adult life, fundamentalism, extremism, terrorism have been mainstays of the A1 paper of the news. And when I became a journalist, I was incredibly interested in reporting on religious fundamentalism and extremism, and religion and politics more generally. And, ever since 2001, maybe a little bit before that, we've heard a lot about how Saudi Arabia exports terrorism, supports Al-Qaeda, and so on. But it's often done in very vague terms. When I was 22, I moved to Indonesia, which is the world's largest Muslim majority country. I moved to its capital, Jakarta, and I started reporting there. And something amazing that happened when I moved there was I started to hear some of the same stuff. That Saudi Arabia was fueling extremism there and fundamentalism, and in some cases jihadism. By the time I moved there, the Islamic State had been in Syria, and hundreds of Indonesians had even gone there. So I became pretty curious why these two countries, and as far as I could tell, many other countries, were convinced that Saudi Arabia had done this to Muslim populations around the world. And there hadn't been a lot of reporting on it. So I started digging into what it meant. And what I found was much more interesting than any throwaway explanation that Saudi Arabia has created all these terrorists, or, that 15 out of the 9/11 hijackers were Saudi nationals, so thus they were the source of all jihadism in the world. What the Saudi campaign really was something more subtle and broad and programmatic than that. So I started reporting on this around Indonesia and Southeast Asia, and I found all these different outposts of Saudi money, universities, scholarships, mosques, person-to-person relationships, embassies, attaches, and so on. And I realized I was onto something bigger than just Indonesia and bigger than Saudi Arabia, because this campaign had actually happened all over the Muslim world. So I decided to turn it into a book. And I want to cast my net wide because there are 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. And since this campaign was worldwide, a book that was about it had to also be global in scope. So I went to 3 places: Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim minority country in the world and the largest population of Muslims in Asia. I went to Nigeria in Africa, which is home to the largest Muslim population in Africa as well. And then I went to Kosovo, which is a small landlocked country in Europe, which has nevertheless been the highest per capita source of jihadists to ISIS from any country in Europe. Kosovo is also about 98% Muslim today. So 3 different countries, 3 different continents, all transformed by the Saudi campaign in the 20th century. And I found some similarities and differences that I'm going to tell you about today. But what I want to, what I was struck by was that there's really no comparison for this campaign in world history. Saudi Arabia is the birthplace of Islam. Islam started there in the 7th century. So it has this unique title that no other country has an analog in other major world religions, in terms of having claimed to give birth to the religion and trying to change everyone who follows it today. So super interesting. So from this desert country in the Gulf, it has stretched its arms across the whole world. So what is Saudi money really? In brief, its effects include intolerance of minorities, religious minorities like the Shea, Ahmadiyya, and also other religions like Christianity and Hinduism and Judaism. It creates a base of Salafi scholars in many countries, and Salafism is the fundamentalist strain of Islam that seeks to return to the traditions of the 8th century. It is cultivated through personal relationships, especially in the post-World War II 20th century. And it funds a whole variety of things, from Islamist political parties to jihadists, to ordinary students who just want to get to know religion better, especially if they grew up in a country where religious life was suppressed for many decades, which is the case in many of the places I visited in my book. The founder of Wahhabism, which is the state religion of Saudi Arabia, which is the religion they tried to propagate worldwide, was a preacher named Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab. He was a very austere desert preacher who looked around him and thought that people had just deviated from the path of true Islam. He saw all these things like worshiping at shrines and graves and celebrating the Prophet's birthday, all of which he felt were getting away from the important thing, which is Tawheed, or monotheism. His interpretation of this deviance was that it had to be treated with violence. So he led this kind of band of Wahhabi raiders who smashed up shrines and punished people and even killed them in the 18th century. And the Saudi royal family, which in the 18th century was trying to assert its claim to this, vast desert peninsula, was impressed by his religious charisma. And they signed a pact in the late 18th century that said, we will protect you and your strain of Islam. In return, you give us religious legitimacy for our rule in Arabia. And that agreement, in some way or another, is in place up until today. So the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia today is still supportive of the Wahhabi clerical establishment, and this strain of Islam is effectively its state religion. So America and Saudi Arabia have a long and weird friendship. Started in 1945 during World War II when FDR met King Abdulaziz on the USS Murphy. And this was within a decade after oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia in 1938. So our friendship was motivated by a lot of things. Oil was always the top priority, but since then it's also been an important security partner and counter-extremism partner for the US in the Middle East. This relationship has come under fire at various times, but again, it remains in place today. The big year that Saudi Dawah started kicking off in the world was 1979. This is a picture of the Iranian Revolution, which happened in 1979, and it was Shia Islamic in nature, and it was a popular revolt against the Shah's royal family. Everything about this terrified Saudi Arabia. It was Shia and not Sunni. It was popular and anti-royalist. If any of these things happened in Saudi Arabia, it would be a disaster. Also in 1979, a group of Islamists inside Saudi Arabia occupied the Grand Mosque in Mecca and accused the royal family of not being Islamic enough. This, again, the combination of these two things happening in 1979 meant that Saudi Arabia's campaign, which started in the 1960s to spread its brand of Islam worldwide, really kicked into high gear. So the 1980s, 1990s were the peak years of the Saudi religious project. Here are some of the books that I saw abroad in my travels in Indonesia and Nigeria, which kind of show how important the Iranian Revolution was and why Saudi Arabia was so scared if a billion Muslims who prayed in the direction of Mecca every day became somehow more interested in Iran's Shia and revolutionary ideology instead. These books are from Indonesia and Nigeria, respectively. So 1980s, Cold War, peak of the US-Saudi partnership. We found a lot in common. The 1980s was a time when America really sought to crush communist activity all around the world, and especially in Afghanistan, where US and Saudi partnered to support the Afghan Mujahideen guerrillas against the Soviet Union. So 1980s is when you see a lot of the peak Saudi soft power projects in the world today, including a university in Indonesia, a religious attaché's office, and a lot of Qurans that are still time-stamped to that decade. And you might recognize the one on the right of this picture, which is our current president, who is famously also a big fan of Saudi Arabia. Saudi money doesn't come just from one place, is what I learned when I was reporting my book. There are a ton of different organizations inside the kingdom that help propagate it abroad. There's a Ministry of Dawah and Islamic Affairs, which is a Saudi government ministry that oversees a lot of missionary activity. There are charities like the Muslim World League, and there are embassies and religious attachés at over 36 countries in the world. So the first country that I want to talk to you briefly about is Indonesia. It's the country I know best. I lived there for several of the last 4 years. And it's the world's largest Muslim majority country, but it has a very unique and diverse religious tradition because of its geographical location and its history with Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity. So there's a lot of folk Islams, there's a lot of syncretic Islams there. A lot of the traditional mosques have, this is an important Javanese mosque that shows how it's kind of syncretic with Hindu and Buddhist traditions at some parts. So in the 1960s, Saudi Arabia found its way into this big country through just one person, and his name was Mohammed Natsir. He was the first prime minister of Indonesia, but then his vision for an Islamic country was not super popular, so he was forced out. And instead of doing more politics, he decided to just work on propagation of traditional Sunni Islam. And Saudi Arabia loved this. He was, immediately they opened the taps to him, and he poured money into Indonesia to support a bunch of different institutions, from scholarships to a very influential boarding school. This is Lipia University in Jakarta. It's a branch of Imam Mohammed bin Saud University in Riyadh, and it's still under the directorship of the Saudi embassy in Jakarta. This is pretty amazing. It's a university completely run by Saudis, completely in Arabic, whose alumni have included some of the most influential Islamist ideologues in the country today. This is one of the schools that Mohammed Natsir funded in the 1970s. It's called the Nuruki School. It's a boarding school that took the name later on as the Ivy League for jihadists. It became a hotbed of jihadi and extremist activity in the 1970s and 1980s, eventually culminating in the Bali bombings of 2002, which was the worst terror attack ever to take place in Indonesia, killing over 200 people. So it came out of the school that was funded by Saudi money. Another alumnus of Lipia University was an Islamist ideologue named Habib Rizik Shihab, who helped organize the biggest Islamist protests in Indonesian history in 2016 and 2017, where they accused the Christian governor of blasphemy and eventually got him sent to jail. So this guy is Habib Rizik. He studied in the Saudi University, and in fact, he still lives in Saudi Arabia today. He was pursued and exiled from Indonesia after all this happened. So he continues to maintain relationships with the kingdom, as do many people who are part of the Saudi project worldwide. The next country I want to talk about briefly is Nigeria, which is a super interesting country, and religion is so contentious there that they don't even ask on the census anymore what religion people are, because it's very controversial whether it's majority Christian or majority Muslim. Basically, the purple and yellow parts in the north are the Muslim regions. These are the regions that have Sharia law today, which is kind of a rough indication of the demographics. Once again, Saudi influence was seeded through just one person in Nigeria. He was a scholar named Dr. Abu Bakr Gumi. He was another good friend of the kingdom, and he helped Nigerian students get scholarships to a Saudi university in Medina called the Islamic University of Medina. So starting in 1965, dozens of Nigerians and eventually hundreds started going to Saudi Arabia to study every year. And they quickly brought the Salafi movement back to Nigeria. Before, Nigeria had been predominantly Sufi, and that was the main religious tradition there. But these Saudi graduates brought an organization and started an organization called Izala, which is a very influential Salafi group that started in the 1970s. The thing in Nigeria is that Salafism eventually broke off. It became slightly more extreme at every iteration. So Izala eventually gave rise to this preacher named Jafar Adam, who was a very influential Salafi. And then Jafar Adam had a very influential student named Muhammad Yusuf, who you might know today as the founder of the group called Boko Haram, the most deadly terror group in Nigeria, which was responsible until this day for hundreds and thousands of kidnappings and killings in Nigeria and the Lake Chad region. Another fact of Saudi influence in Nigeria has been the rise of an anti-Shia movement. This is a 1,000-day protest, like almost a 4-year-long protest put on by the main contentious Shia group in Nigeria called the Islamic Movement. And in 2016, the Nigerian military killed over 200 of their members. And since then, Salafi and Shia conflict has been raging in Nigeria almost daily. So this is a photo I took from one of the protests of theirs that I attended, and which shows no signs of stopping today. And worldwide, Sunni Shia conflict is a major effect of Saudi proselytization. Moving on to Kosovo, this is a photo of Lavdrim Muhajeri. He was an ISIS commander who became very well known for his Albanian language unit that he commanded in the Islamic State. How did so many Albanian-speaking people join ISIS that they had their own unit? In large part, it was because Saudi Arabia started to spread Salafism in the Albanian-speaking Balkans around 20 years ago. Today, Kosovo has to date sent over 400 foreign fighters to ISIS. So for a country of that size, just 2 million people, that's a huge number. Kosovo is a super interesting case study because you can see the whole shape of their investments there. Saudi Arabia started coming to Kosovo during the end of the Yugoslav wars. So starting in 1998, 1999, Saudi charities were part of the war relief effort in Kosovo as, first of all, it broke away, Yugoslavia dissolved, and then within a few years, Kosovo also broke off from Serbia and declared independence. So the US famously was responsible for the NATO bombing that ended the Kosovo war against the Serbs. But US and UN administration in Kosovo didn't really look after the religious aspect very much, even though this was a very traumatized community that didn't have any mosques or religious life to speak of. And that's exactly where Saudi charities came in, and they helped to furnish mosques and preachers, textbooks, Qurans in post-war Kosovo. During my travels in Kosovo, I came across a huge variety of Albanian language, Salafi, and Wahhabi books that have been translated and distributed over the course of 2 decades of Saudi investment in this country. And these have been really influential, and the pamphlet on the bottom is basically ISIS propaganda in the Albanian language. There's so many Salafis in Kosovo today that they have their own TV station called Peace TV Albanian that plays Salafi content all day long. And in short, they've managed to have huge impact in this small country in a pretty small time. Given all of the stuff that I learned over the course of my book, and which I go into more detail in the call, you might be wondering what's next. Is Saudi Arabia going to keep doing this? Who's going to stop them? It's had so many, somewhat deleterious effects in so many different places. The good and bad news. Saudi investment in the Muslim world has definitely peaked. As I said, 9/11 was a big turning point, and ever since then, they have never been able to proselytize abroad with such a blank check. There have been especially a lot of scrutiny on the financial outflows of Saudi Arabia. And under Vision 2030, which is the economic modernization program of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, religion is taking a backseat to some of his other projects like tourism and economic diversification. It remains to be seen whether he will be successful at reforming the Wahhabi establishment. He has already shown that human rights are not a huge priority for him on absolute terms, as evidenced by the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. But for the first time in modern Saudi history, religion is not the forefront of their public face to the world. They're trying to reframe Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab as a sort of founding father and not as an extremist preacher, which good luck with that. But I did visit his mosque outside Riyadh in historical Diriyah last year, and they are trying to spin Saudi history, which has certain concrete facts, and put a different kind of face on it. So it's a very interesting effort. We'll have to see how it pans out in the next few years. The new head of the Muslim World League is one of these characteristic figures who is talking in the Vision 2030 vernacular. His name is Dr. Muhammad Al-Isa. He goes to a lot of conferences with names like moderation and tolerance and pluralism, and he's also even acknowledged something like the Holocaust in New York, which is a big step for a key member of the Wahhabi establishment. So some changes are afoot, though we're looking at a 6-decade campaign here. So, it's hard to roll it all back at once. Finally, you might recognize this image from one of the many stark images that we've seen arising from the coronavirus pandemic. This is an almost empty Kaaba, the holiest shrine in Islam. Saudi Arabia has had to shut down all minor pilgrimages into the kingdom, and it seems likely that it'll even shut down the Hajj this year. And Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca, is one of the most important Saudi soft power tools that the kingdom has today. What's going to happen if they don't have a Hajj this year, or if the Hajj declines in importance? Well, it's actually just going to accelerate something that's already happening, which is that Saudi Arabia is not going to be at the forefront of the Muslim world. There'll be a multipolar Muslim world where a lot of different countries are pushing their own national Islams. It's going to be a more crowded stage. And, even if some of these countries have very ambitious projects, such as Turkey, which has goals to spread Turkish soft power in Africa and Europe, it's never going to rise to exactly the same level of influence as Saudi Arabia did in the 20th century. So if you want to learn more about what exactly that was, I encourage you to read my book, but that's my overview for now. And I'm going to turn it over to Cécile to discuss this a little bit more.
Well, thanks. You just hit on one of the questions that I had, which I found very interesting, where you talked about Turkey's new influence in places like Africa, which I hadn't even been focused on. We hear a lot about China's influence in Africa. Can you talk a little bit more about what the competing international forces are in Islam? You talked about some of the other Gulf states. Obviously, Iran was a huge player. They seem to have pulled way back in terms of some of their religious education programs, and then you have this new interesting issue of Turkey. So could you talk a little bit more about the other players out there right now?
Yeah. So Saudi-Iran was the big rivalry of the 80s and 90s. But as you said, Iran has had to scale it back. They have their own, they've been severely hit by sanctions and have their own domestic agenda to take care of and putting out fires there. And in terms of proxy wars, they're mostly interested in their own backyard, places like Syria and Lebanon. So that's no longer a dynamic in the greater Muslim world. But a lot of other Gulf states like Kuwait and Qatar and the UAE are all doing their own proselytization abroad now, and they all have different orientations. So Qatar is very interested in political Islam and tends to support Islamist movements, and the UAE has been trying to support Sufi-oriented movements. So it's just a more crowded field now. Of course, none of these countries can claim to be the birthplace of Islam, so they have slightly, one step removed legitimacy as Saudi Arabia did. But I would say almost every Gulf state is involved in some kind of Saudi-style proselytization now.
And what about Turkey?
Turkey is very interesting. It's by far the most important Islamic power in the Balkans. Turkey's Diyanet, which is the religious ministry, is responsible for all Hajj pilgrimages of all Balkan countries now, which is a pretty big step because Saudi charities used to be in charge of that. They're also renovating all the mosques along the Balkans, and they have historic ties as they are all former Ottoman colonies. More interesting too, and it's kind of, it remains to be seen what will come of this, but Turkey's been running direct flights to Kano. There's a lot of Turkish development happening in Nigeria and in East Africa. The thing is, their Islamic traditions are not as textbook laid out as Saudi Arabia's was, where there's like a few specific books that you always see around the world with Saudi projects. So I'm not sure what their end game is in Africa, and their economic situation is not as good as used to be, so I think they might find themselves stretched a little bit. But it's a super interesting development to keep watching, like what kind of Islam they're going to want to support.
I mean, I guess that was my question, because Erdogan's Islam is perhaps not the same as previous governments' Islam, right? So, but what I'm hearing you say is it's a little too early to know exactly what they're going to be like ideologically. I was also thinking, because I think one of the main themes of your book is that our underlying themes is that the world was kind of asleep or not paying enough attention to a lot of what was going on with the Saudi proselytizing in various countries. And we were very happy to have them spending money on other things that maybe Western bureaucrats historically don't care about or don't pay attention to, like rebuilding mosques in Kosovo or paying attention to religious education. I remembered when I served in Pakistan at the working level, there was a huge debate going on over whether we should provide textbooks to madrasas. And some people said we should only provide American purchased textbooks to public schools to help them strengthen their programs. Others, including myself, said, well, it's an enormous opportunity. There's hundreds of thousands of young boys enrolled in madrasas, and if they could get American textbooks and see that message on the front page, this book is a gift to the people of Pakistan from the people of the United States, that we could at least ensure that they were getting a more well-rounded education. Ultimately, I lost, and we were not giving textbooks to madrasas. But in retrospect, are there things that the Western powers should have paid attention to and could have done at the time? And I'm asking this because I worry that we're missing things that other countries are doing right now and not paying enough attention, and we're not going to realize that until it's too late.
Well, yeah. I mean, not only did we not pay attention, we actively encouraged Saudi proselytization, and the dark money feel of it was seen as a feature, not a bug, especially in the Carter administration, the Reagan administration. So like Henry Kissinger wrote about this period in his memoirs, that a lot of the places where America tried to foil communist activities in the 80s, places like Egypt, you would find helpful Saudi traces everywhere. So we really encouraged their specific project in the 80s. So I don't even think it was a question of oversight so much as like it made sense at the time. And then after the Gulf War, and then after 9/11, the American position on Islamic fundamentalism completely did a 180. So, that was, to me, that was a big mistake. But I also take some comfort in the fact that keeping our eye on the ball has helped so much. I mean, I've been to, every single country I've been to has said that since 2001, there's been such a steep drop off in Saudi funds because the world started paying attention and put pressure on Saudi. The Muslim World League in Nigeria, which was once a super influential charity, is now just one person. And he said after 9/11, we just stopped getting money from Saudi Arabia. And it just like made financial outflows a lot harder. So I'm pretty confident that we're never going to see that degree of proselytization ever again, in terms of supporting Al-Qaeda training camps and things like that. But I think, it's a good reminder that you do have to think through, when you think we're going to support this project abroad, what does that mean? It always has unintended consequences.
So we have a lot of questions here. I'm going to look at some of them. You've talked a little bit about MBS, and oh my goodness, there are a bunch of questions about MBS. You talked about that it's a little unclear of how he or his government or whatever government we're going to have over the next 10 years is trying to balance this history of Wahhabism with becoming a more global, perhaps more modern country. And in your book, you're a little cynical, not cynical, but a questioning, right? Yeah. You say on the one hand, he kind of has let women drive, but on the other hand, he's still extremely anti-Shia, which is a core tenet of Wahhabism. So I'm going to roll all these MBS questions into one. Someone asks, oh my goodness, it kind of dropped out. But I guess the other one is, do you personally think that MBS has been reined in since Khashoggi? It sure doesn't look like it. I think you just mentioned that, but maybe you could speak to that also.
Well, he's said a lot of things. He said, we're going to end extremism within one generation. The good thing is Saudi Arabia is very conscious about this image that they have now. A lot of people in the world see them as exporters of terrorism, and they're eager to shed that image. So I think that impulse is positive, and we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater and question everything about it. In MBS's Vision 2030 plan, only one of the 13 priorities relate in any way to Islam or religion, and that's just about Hajj. Everything else is about economics and stuff like that. But in terms of him cracking down on the Wahhabi establishment, who has he put in jail? He's not putting the extreme Wahhabi ideologues in jail. He's not putting the people who say the earth is at the center of the universe, not the sun, in jail, which, by the way, is a key Wahhabi belief. He's putting in jail people who promote human rights or push for civil reforms or try to hold him accountable for anything inside the kingdom. So in terms of his crackdown on extremism, the reality has been different than the rhetoric. Yeah. So I think not taking him at face value is very important. I'm not a defeatist at all. I really think that especially from the American side, we have such leverage with this relationship that it can make a difference if we and the global community continue to hold them to account for what for what they're saying and intend to do. Like if they're really serious about this, then they should not jail the clerics that they have, for example. So I think he's very sensitive and he wants to change it. The way he's gone about it, as with everything else, is incredibly clumsy and maybe even counterproductive.
Yeah. So I'm going to join one of my questions with one of the questions from the audience here. In your travels to these countries, are you seeing a lot of Chinese influence? Because in some ways, the Chinese, in a religious sense, are doing what the Saudis were trying to do in the 80s, right? Which is spend a lot of money to gain influence. The related question is, are the Saudis trying to do anything to help the Uyghurs? And is there anything that they could do?
Latter is an amazing question. No, the answer is no. Because
they're not helping the Uyghurs.
It's not a priority because Saudi-China relations are very strong, and China is relating to the first thing. China is funded the construction of the train between Mecca and Medina. There are so many Chinese migrant workers in Saudi Arabia today that the Dawah ministry has created a new wing focused on converting Chinese people to Islam.
Really?
So, the new frontier of China Dawah today is converting Chinese migrant workers. So they're not going to criticize the Uyghur issue. Famously, much of the Muslim world has been quiet about this because it's just too politically risky to criticize this, issue. And Saudi Arabia is not about to change that. China is incredibly important to the infrastructure and modernization goals that the modern Saudi state has. In terms of Chinese influence, I guess the person is maybe trying to draw a comparison between Belt and Road and the Saudi campaign. I think they are, broadly speaking, somewhat related in terms of very ambitious global projects. I think the Chinese infrastructure effort, it has just like a lot more money in absolute terms than Saudi Arabia ever did. But also, I'm not sure what kind of specific ideology they would be wanting to see other than a general goodwill towards China. So I think it's a little bit apples to oranges, but they are similarly global projects.
And someone asked if Saudi Arabia sees the Belt and Road as a threat. It sounds like you're saying no.
No.
And could you say a little bit more about migrant workers? Because I was very interested in your book, and I'm surprised they're trying to convert Chinese, but in your book you talk about them trying to convert, but it's not conversion in our traditional sense, right? Convert Muslims from countries like Pakistan or Bangladesh to Wahhabism or Salafist viewpoints. And they see that as being a really fertile ground. Do you want to talk a little more about that? Because there are a lot of guest workers in Saudi Arabia.
Totally. And guest workers have been some of the most influential kind of vectors of this religion in both ways. So there's two kinds of dawah, right? There's dawah of non-Muslims to bring them into the Saudi version of Islam, which is just a straight up conversion. And then there would be dawah for kind of like maybe people who don't think that much about what kind of Muslim they are from like Bangladesh or Pakistan, and to make them more in line with the Salafi or Wahhabi project. China Dawah is super interesting. I recommend anyone who's interested to look up the work of Muhammad Turki al-Sudairi on this. Basically, there is this super popular phenomenon where like a lot of imams will run these mass conversion programs for Chinese guest workers. And it started because Saudi public was getting really annoyed that these non-believers were there in large numbers in the two holiest cities of Islam building this road. And so they started this campaign enlisting Chinese students in Medina to figure out how to convert them. And there's like videos on YouTube of these mass conversions of Chinese guest workers. And there's also a phenomenon of Saudi clerics traveling to proselytize amongst Hui Muslims in China, who are like the other kind of Muslims who are not, they're not Uyghurs, kind of different and just more evenly distributed type of Chinese Muslim. And then in terms of other guest workers, yeah, I mean, if you're spending 3, 5, 7 years working in the Gulf from the Philippines or Pakistan or Bangladesh, you're going to go to mosque there and maybe even go hear from some of the imams there, maybe even pick up some of the books. And that's kind of been an organic kind of dispersion of Saudi ideas. I will say it doesn't always work that way. Like I've met people in Indonesia, like maids specifically, who are infamously abused there in cases, who went to Saudi and hated what they saw there so much religion-wise that they became Shia, like boomeranged in the other way. So it's not like a universally appealing project, and it has a whole mixed bag of effects.
So I want to combine two questions, which are kind of unrelated because I think we're running out of time. You do mention that Saudi Arabia supported some of their NGOs supported some of the Kashmiri terrorists, I guess, in the 80s. What other influence or work have you seen of Saudi Arabia in India or Kashmir? But I think the question specifically is, are Saudi organizations, religious organizations, operating in India, and have they had an influence there? And secondly, have you seen an influence of Saudi money, particularly I think Saudi religious money probably, but Saudi money generally in the US?
Those are good questions. I didn't look specifically at India. So there is, some Saudi Dawa in India, but India has its own religious traditions, like the Deobandi school, which is arguably more important in the Indian context. And
Pakistan.
And Pakistan. So I cannot speak much to the Kashmir issue. I don't think it's the most influential factor there. I would definitely say like national dynamics are probably more important to radicalization of people in Kashmir. That's just me. And then what was the second question?
The U.S. And I think the question is quite broad because we know Saudi money and particularly Saudi oil has a political impact in the U.S. But what about some of the mosques? I mean, there was a hugely controversial school that they built in Fairfax County outside of Washington a few years ago. What are they doing in terms of the religious community here in the U.S.?
So, the Fairfax, so they did run this kind of like Saudi Islamic Academy in Fairfax, Virginia for quite a while, but it was closed in 2016. And they have given, I think the Muslim World League has a branch in America and has supported several mosques. I don't think they have been so bold in their dawah at all. In America, they're much more interested in the Saudi PR lobby and oil relationship and bilateral relations. So to me, it's not a major feature of our country's relationship domestically.
I was also, what you talk about is in your book kind of mirrors some of the research found at the Chicago Project on, CPOS, Security and Terrorism, the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism, where they have found that a lot of the recruiting these days of these Islamist groups is not based on religion. It's based on people wanting to be a part of something bigger than themselves, do something important, and that kind of recruiting is particularly effective in the United States and Canada, apparently in Kosovo, based on what you wrote about here. And also what we've seen in other countries, and I think that CPOST has found too, the less educated a young person is in Islam, the easier it is to recruit him because he's kind of has less inoculation against what people are telling him. You want to talk a little bit more about how folks are being recruited to some of the more extreme aspects of Islam in some of these countries?
Yeah. So I would say definitely Kosovo is a textbook example of that. The post-war reconstruction of Kosovo has been so patchy that, having Kosovo passport today is almost like ineffectual. It's not recognized by so many countries. One of the only countries they can travel to freely is Turkey, which is why some of them found it so easy to go to Syria. There's so many real socioeconomic factors there. I don't like to explain away everything about jihadism with socioeconomic factors. I would just say there's a mix. In Indonesia, a lot of the most hardened jihadists are from middle-class families. They're not the poorest of the poor.
Right.
I met a huge family of 26 people who migrated to join ISIS, and they were well-off business people. They believed in the caliphate. So I don't think
9/11 bombers were generally the same.
Yeah. Well, Osama bin Laden is from one of the richest families
exactly
in the Middle East. The bin Ladens are, super wealthy. So I would say that there's no one explanation for terrorism. In a lot of places, socioeconomic things exacerbate an existing problem. So Boko Haram is the perfect example of that, right?
Yeah.
The whole reason this ideology came to Nigeria is because of Saudi influence in the 60s and 70s. But then it was really aggravated by like the Nigerian security state, climate change, the drying up of the Chad Basin, people's livelihoods evaporated. So, nothing happens in a vacuum. So unfortunately, It's not a cut and dry answer, but.
No, it's great. Thank you very much. Krithika Varagur, author of the new book, The Call, very good book, available at your local bookstore or online. It's also available electronically. We have recorded this event, and it will be available on YouTube and on the council's webpage and on other social media platforms in a few hours. So spread the word to your friends via your own social media platforms, or you're free to watch it again if you would like to. We have a lot of programs coming up. Please check them out online. And once again, to our members, or to those of you in particular who are not members but might be interested in becoming members, we welcome you to do that again online. Our memberships start at $100 a year, and we thank you for your continuing support. With that, Krithika, do you have any last words? You have 30 seconds.
Well, my email's on my website, so if anyone's question is unanswered, feel free to shoot me a direct message. But thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Thank you, and thank you for writing such a great book. Thanks. And thank you all for tuning in.